One of the things that I think is important is that people tell the truth about Palestine. They tell the truth about what is happening to the Palestinians. They tell the truth about what is happening in the West Bank, in Gaza and in East Jerusalem. That they tell the truth about the denial of Palestinian rights. And that they tell the truth about what is happening to Palestinians inside Israel being treated as second-class citizens. And it's not an exaggeration, as B'Tselem has said, as Human Rights Watch has said, as Amnesty International has said, to say that this has similarities to the apartheid regime of South Africa. And that is the truth. And I think what supporters of Israel are afraid of, and those who back them, and make accusations about people who are critical of Israel, what they're afraid of is that. They're afraid that the truth will come out, and that's what they're worried about. So I think it's important that people go on telling the truth and broadcasting it as loudly as possible and giving support to the Palestinians so a just and lasting peace can be found. I'm Bernard Regan. I'm a retired member of the National Education Union. I taught for nearly 40 years in schools in London, and I was a member of the National Executive of the National Union of Teachers. Currently I'm a trustee of the National Education Union, and I've been involved in Palestine campaigning for more than 40 years. Britain has a lot to answer for in terms of what has happened to the Palestinians, and it's been responsible for developments in that area going back to the beginning of the 20th century, when Britain adopted what was called the Balfour Declaration, which was a declaration which was given to the Zionist organisation, Zionist Federation, saying that Britain would guarantee a homeland for the Jews in the territory of Palestine. And Britain was involved from that time right through until 1948. Essentially, Palestine was a colony of the British, and in 1948 the British left and the State of Israel was declared. But the British were responsible throughout that time for governing that in a way which had an impact on the politics of the area. It had an impact on the economy of the area, had an impact on the social development of the area in a way which was detrimental and harmed the interests of the Palestinian people. Britain, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was a massive colonial power. You have to appreciate that it actually governed nearly a quarter of the Earth's territory, a quarter of the world's population at the time. And Britain was interested in Palestine for a variety of reasons, all of them to do with British interests, in my view, not really to do with the interest of Jewish people who were suffering pogroms in Eastern Europe, who were facing anti-Semitism in areas like Russia and Poland and Eastern Europe and in Germany as well. And the British interest was really about their imperial desires and their imperial wishes. So these three things, defence of India and the British interests, access and control of the Suez Canal and control over oil, were really the driving forces of British interests. So in a way, in my view, they used the Zionist idea of a Jewish state on the territory of Palestine for their own interests. And they were quite duplicitous about how they went about it. And Britain was very anti-Semitic. I mean, this is something which is often written out of history. In the early 20th century, they introduced the Aliens Act in 1905, which was designed specifically to keep Jews out of Britain. And even, I mean, it's further along the road in terms of the history of the whole story. But in the 1930s, Britain and America were exactly the same. They did not help Jewish people escape the pogroms, the impact of fascism in Germany. They restricted the number of migrants that could come into Britain and into the United States of America and kept them out. So it was very much, I think, a question of Britain serving its own interests by signing and making this declaration and saying they would support the creation of a Jewish state on the land of historic Palestine. After the Balfour Declaration, Britain continued to rule, as I said, in Palestine, and in particular suppressed an uprising by the Palestinians between 1936 and 1939. And it's not talked about a great deal, but it was an absolutely vicious repression of the Palestinian people who were seeking to establish self-determination, to create a Palestinian state, to be independent, and so on and so forth. And the British suppressed it. The accounts of it are quite horrific in terms of things like establishing concentration camps, in terms of things like punishment using human shields, in terms of the torture that they imposed on prisoners that they took during that fight. I mean, the accounts of that are absolutely gruesome and are really not documented publicly or not known about very widely. So Britain kind of was very much determined that its will should prevail in the area. From 1948 onwards, or obviously after the Second World War, the British really became a further weakened. The British imperialism was already in decline after the First World War, but this accelerated with the Second World War, when Britain essentially was in debt to the United States of America. But the interests that were there in the region, the ones that I've talked about, like oil and so on, was so important as a strategic resource that the British wanted to retain some kind of influence in the area. The catalyst for NUT, National Union of Teachers' involvement in Palestine, really began in the early 1980s. Israel unleashed a war against Lebanon, and during the course of that war, an attack was unleashed against two Palestinian refugee camps near Beirut called Sabra and Shatila. And the attack that was unleashed was actually carried out by Lebanese phalangists, neo-fascists or fascist armed groups who went into the camps of Sabra and Shatila and carried out a massacre of women and children in particular, and older men, with the protection of the Israeli army, who stood at the gates of those two refugee camps, preventing anybody leaving or anybody coming in or going out. And this horrendous events really reverberated across the world. People everywhere were raising the question of an investigation into what had happened, for justice for those who had been killed, and for, in the course of that, of course, recognition of the rights of the Palestinian people. We passed a resolution on the National Executive of the Union calling for an international inquiry and putting that forward to the Trade Union Congress, which is the body in Britain that represents all the organised trade unions. And that was the kind of demand we put forward. Subsequent to that, becoming more and more aware of the discrimination that Palestinians faced and the oppression that they faced, we began to explore what was happening in the field of education as it affected Palestinian children and their rights. And one of the initiatives that was taken was a modest but symbolically very significant, to support a refugee camp, a Balata refugee camp, as a way of expressing support for children and young people in Palestine and in the occupied West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. Then eventually, in the early part of this century, the Union decided to affiliate to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and to become more openly involved in that. Since that time, the Union has actually sent delegations across to look at the education system for the Palestinian children and young people, and has made reports on that, and has raised issues of concern with the British government and other appropriate bodies about what is happening to Palestinians, particularly Palestinians, for example, in the refugee camps, whose education is provided by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, and is very vulnerable to the withdrawal of international funds by the United States or by Britain, which could jeopardize the education of those children. So it's become involved in expressing concerns about that, but also in expressing support for and solidarity with the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination and for them to live in dignity. The Union's concern about the education of Palestinian children stems from seeing firsthand the experience that they have. There are very obvious things at a physical level which are a challenge for Palestinian children going to school. For example, inside the West Bank, there are somewhere like 530 checkpoints. These are obstacles which the children have to pass on a daily basis going to school. You cannot make, it's almost impossible to make any journey of any significant length, even a few kilometres in Palestine, without having to cross a checkpoint. In addition to that, in some cases where the children are going past or near to settlement buildings, or where Israeli settlers live inside the occupied West Bank, they face all kinds of potential of physical attacks, stone throwing, verbal abuse, physical attacks, and so on. And we've witnessed that. We've seen that in cities like Hebron, where children have literally had to run the gauntlet past children of their same age in some cases, throwing stones, shouting, abusing them, and so on, with the Israeli army looking on and doing nothing to intervene in that. But the Palestinian children subject to this kind of perpetual harassment, and children being picked up off the streets by the Israeli army. And tragically, we've seen in recent days Palestinian children being shot and killed by the Israeli armed forces without first of all, the Israeli army should not be there, but let's leave that for the moment. But those children being killed without any justification whatsoever. The union has made available for members, if they wish, the opportunity to go on delegations to Palestine and to Israel, and they visit both. They go to schools and kindergartens, they meet with teachers, fellow teachers, they meet with education administrators, trade unionists, community groups, particularly in the West Bank. They have a difficulty. It's not been possible to go to Gaza. And they also meet Palestinians inside Israel and listen to the situation and the circumstances that they are confronted with. So that happens twice a year when those delegations go. As I mentioned previously, it's not the only country to which delegations are sent. They go to others as well. But it is an opportunity for people to see firsthand. And without exception, those who go recognise the injustice that the Palestinian people face and come back, and they do meetings, they talk to district branches, they talk to their own members of their own community, in some cases church groups or solidarity campaign groups or whatever, explaining what they've seen and giving detail and testimony to what is actually happening there.
On our first full day, when we were here, really put everything into very, very stark contrast. Here we had a city where a few hundred Israeli settlers have taken over the centre of a city, and they are reinforced by thousands of Israeli soldiers. The Israeli soldiers have not allowed Palestinian people to walk down certain streets of their own town. They cut off the roads with checkpoints. Children have to deal with these checkpoints and with these soldiers and with these oppressions on a daily basis. They accuse their teachers of acts of terrorism and violence, which are blatantly not true. And for me, that was particularly shocking and particularly saddening, because it highlighted many of the apartheids which exist in this country.
Being in Hebron and not seeing anything dramatic in the regards of people being chased down streets, but just seeing the systematic and technological suppression of these people.
They can't even go to school properly. Their pathways to a school are fenced off and barbed wired. It's true brutality.
I think what has really struck me over the years, and I've been to Palestine since the mid-1990s, has been the expansion of the settlers, the settlements built on the West Bank in particular. There are now, I would estimate, getting on for between 3/4 and 1 million Israeli citizens living in the West Bank in what people call settlements, but actually they're towns. Settlement is a misnomer, really, because they are occupation towns in contravention of the Geneva Convention, which says that an occupying power does not have the right to transfer members of its own people to the occupied territories in which it is operating. So that expansion of the settlements is really very marked, and it's very graphic because the way they're built on the hilltops. And one Palestinian friend described it to me as being like the Crusaders building their forts on the hills, overlooking and looking down upon the Palestinians in the valleys. And that is progressively, over the last 25 years now, has been something that has really been quite shocking. There are personal incidents, like, for example, going to a checkpoint with a group of people, some of whom were of Muslim heritage, and very obviously of Muslim heritage, either wearing a hijab or people with a beard, and them being summoned out of the car we were travelling in and questioned and held at checkpoints for an hour or 2 hours when they had British passports. And one thought that this was unproblematic, but clearly not in the eyes of the Israeli military. And that being something that went on, continuously, people being held at the airport for hours on end and questioned in the most aggressive way, unjustifiable way, people who were just coming to visit and nothing else. Other occasions, going through checkpoints, being stopped by 17, 18, 19-year-olds who were carrying machine guns and who were quite brutal and kind of quite aggressive in questioning where people were from, what they were doing, and so on and so forth. And this kind of general behaviour of, one has to say, almost uniformly arrogant, aggressive, in that kind of a way, and seeing those kind of things happen. Going to a place like Nabi Salah, a village where Israeli settlers were seeking to take possession and ownership of a well which served the village, and the people in the villagers going on demonstrations. I wasn't present on any of the demonstrations, but going to the well to express their rights in respect to access to the water, and being attacked physically and verbally abused, and people actually being killed who were doing no more than protesting, carrying Palestinian flags, and being joined by Israelis who were opposed to what the Israeli army was doing and expressing their opposition to that. So those kind of things, and lots of kind of very sort of insignificant kind of appearing incidents, like the whole process of going through checkpoints inside a city like Hebron, which is a Palestinian city, but going into a quarter in which only a few hundred Israeli citizens lived, and having to be body scanned and checked, like going through airport security, going in and coming out, walking down a road which was in which Palestinians and people who lived in the city of Hebron were actually prevented from walking through and not being allowed to accompany us walking through a street in their own town. Or again, going to the marketplace in Hebron, to the market where above our heads was wire mesh and in some cases tarpaulin. And when you looked up at this mesh, what you could see were bricks and stones, bottles and all kinds of things which had been thrown on people below from the Israeli residents in the flats above the marketplace, and people just prevented from walking through there unhindered. And the tarpaulin being there, we were told and explained, was because they had thrown oil and urine and other, liquids onto people below in order to intimidate them, to drive them away from that area. Going into the mosque in Hebron, which is divided between one part which is now a synagogue and the other part which is a mosque, in which you could still see the bullet holes of a Jewish settler, Israeli Jewish settler, who had gone into the mosque and killed people in Hebron, still seeing those bullet holes on the wall and seeing where people had died. And then leaving Hebron and going past a street where there was actually a garden that had been established to commemorate, I think he was called Baruch Goldstein, if I remember correctly, who had carried out this massacre of Palestinians, and the garden was there to celebrate and commemorate this person. And, just the kind of notion that in a holy place anything like this should ever happen, let alone they should happen at all, was something quite shocking and quite horrendous. So lots and lots of memories and anecdotes that people had told me which were along the lines that I've described. So when you look at the government that is being formed at the moment by Benjamin Netanyahu and the political parties that are aligned with him to form a coalition to establish the government, some of them have policies which explicitly refuse to recognise the rights of the Palestinians to have a state. They actually have a view that one would have to say the consequences of the logic of their positions is that Palestinians would be driven out of the West Bank, and that Gaza might be pushed into some kind of relationship with Egypt. And I think what is astounding is the resilience of the Palestinians, the fact that they have not given up hope of achieving their legitimate aspiration for a Palestinian state, that they have not given up their hope for justice for the refugees who were driven out in 1948 and 1967, and the fact that they have not given up hope that their children will live in a world in which they are recognised for who they are. They are Palestinians. And I think the literacy rate in Palestine is amongst the highest in the region. There are numbers of universities in the West Bank and in Gaza. I think the Palestinian people are immensely creative and determined, and I have confidence that they will in the end succeed, but it's going to be a long and difficult road. And our job from the point of view of solidarity is try to make that shorter by ending our government's complicity in the continued oppression, by selling arms to Israel, by being complicit in the Israeli government's actions. And so I think that the international solidarity movement is absolutely vital to the Palestinian cause. But in the end, of course, the Palestinians will have to decide, whether they, or what kind of state they wish to live in and how that will be. There are people that have different formulations of what might happen for the future, whether it would be one state or two states or what should come about. And the view that I take, and people in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign take, is that that's a matter for the Palestinians to determine. So I think that the National Education Union, having that kind of perspective, will continue to support Palestinian rights as one of the most egregious examples at this moment in time of the way in which people are discriminated against and exploited. And I'm sure that will continue to be the case. And they will take up other causes as well, insofar as they have the resources to do that, to call for injustices to be eradicated. And in the words of Che Guevara, a better world is possible. And the NEU, I think, will continue to work for that.